Look at the average survival cache. You will see towering stacks of freeze-dried meals, vacuum-sealed tactical trauma kits, and heavy steel safes loaded with silver bars and gold coins. The modern prepper approaches the end of the world like they are outfitting a high-budget paramilitary vacation. They assume the future will operate on the exact same logic as the present, just with more camouflage and a few power outages. But history tells a different, much darker story. When the grid actually goes down, when the global supply chains snap, and when the fragile illusion of civilized society shatters, all that expensive, hyper-specialized gear becomes a massive liability. You cannot eat silver. You cannot sanitize a festering wound with a crypto wallet. In a true long-term systemic collapse, the currency that dictates who lives and who dies is not shiny, and it is certainly not digital. It is liquid, it is volatile, and it is incredibly cheap. The ultimate post-collapse currency is bottom-shelf, unflavored, high-proof vodka. This sounds like a joke. It sounds like the cynical punchline to a dark bar story. But if you study the anatomy of failed states, a terrifying and consistent pattern emerges. Look at the grueling siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, or the brutal economic freefall of the Soviet Union. The items people thought would save them almost never did. Fiat currency became worthless paper overnight, used only to kindle fires. Specialized, high-tech medical supplies ran out in a matter of weeks and could never be replaced because the factories that made them no longer existed. What remained was a desperate, violent need for raw resources that could solve multiple, severe problems simultaneously. You need something that absolutely never spoils. You need something that requires zero refrigeration. You need something that holds universal, undeniable value to every single human being left alive. Cheap vodka is not a beverage in the wasteland. It is a chemical multi-tool in a glass bottle. It is fuel, it is medicine, it is psychological relief, and most importantly, it is absolute leverage. Trade medium number one is biological control. The misconception here is profound and widespread. Most people believe that surviving a collapse means surviving the initial cinematic event, the economic crash, the grid failure, or the invading army. Because of this, they build reinforced bunkers and stockpile specialized antibiotics or expensive single-use trauma dressings. They assume they will simply pull a fresh, sterile bandage out of a perfectly sealed plastic wrapper whenever they get a scratch. But manufactured medical supplies have hard expiration dates. Antibiotics degrade and lose their chemical efficacy. When the pharmacies are stripped bare within the first 72 hours and the laboratories stop producing medical washes, that specialized trauma kit becomes a ticking clock. Once it is empty, you are entirely defenseless against the actual, invisible apex predator of the apocalypse. The brutal reality of human survival is microscopic. During the worst modern conflicts, the vast majority of casualties did not come from shrapnel, artillery, or gunfire. In a shattered world, the grim truth is that a simple scratch from rusted metal will kill you faster than a bullet. Without modern sanitation, a blister from walking too far becomes a lethal infection. A minor cut from scavenging turns into full-blown sepsis. Bacteria thrive in the filth of a collapsed society, and they do not negotiate. This is where cheap, high-proof alcohol transcends its status as a vice and becomes a non-negotiable lifesaver. Ethanol is a brute force biological weapon. It works through a merciless physical process called denaturation. It does not wait for a complex immune response to kick in. It simply contacts the bacterial cell membrane, tears it open, and completely destroys the vital proteins inside. It is absolute, indiscriminate chemical warfare against infection, and it works every single time. The tactical fix is as unglamorous as it gets. You do not need top-tier medical-grade ethanol to keep yourself and your group alive. You need pure volume. You need cases upon cases of the cheapest, nastiest, highest-proof vodka you can legally buy in bulk right now. When you are forced to scavenge for crude instruments, you will use that vodka to sterilize tweezers before pulling shards of glass from a wound. When someone in your camp steps on a rusted nail in the dark, you will use it to forcefully flush the toxic debris from the puncture. It hurts, it burns like fire, but it fundamentally prevents the rot from setting in. It leaves no toxic residue behind, and unlike modern pharmaceuticals, a sealed glass bottle of vodka has a shelf life of forever. You store it in dark, cool places, and it waits patiently. While the rest of the world desperately trades away their gold rings for a single bottle of clean water, you will hold the raw chemical power to stop gangrene in its tracks. Trade medium number 2 is psychological anesthesia. The misconception here is deeply ingrained in modern survival culture. The prepper community is obsessively focused on caloric intake, thermal regulation, and tactical perimeters. They calculate exactly how many dried beans and bags of rice it takes to keep a human heart beating for a year. They measure the thermal retention of their sleeping bags and the tensile strength of their paracord. They assume that as long as the physical body is fueled and sheltered, the human machine will just keep operating. But they entirely ignore the ghost inside the machine. You can build a concrete fortress filled with 10 years of food, but if the mines locked inside that fortress shatter, the reinforced walls mean absolutely nothing. The brutal reality of systemic collapse is that it is not a rugged, character-building camping trip. It is a relentless, waking nightmare of grief, terror, and hypervigilance. In a prolonged disaster, the human mind will snap long before the physical body starves to death. The sheer psychological gravity of losing everything you have ever known destroys cognitive function. The burden of burying friends, of trusting no one, and of living in constant, grinding paranoia wears down the nervous system like sandpaper. People eventually lose the basic biological will to keep fighting. They stop eating, they make fatal tactical mistakes, and they simply shut down in the dark. This is where a cheap, plastic-handled jug of vodka ceases to be a recreational luxury and becomes an emergency psychological tourniquet. Alcohol is a powerful, rapid-acting central nervous system depressant. It does not solve the root problem, but it forcefully dials down the panic response. It blunts the razor-sharp edge of trauma just enough to allow a shattered mind a few hours of artificial, chemical peace. The tactical fix is treating this resource with the cold objectivity of a combat medic. You are not throwing a party at the end of the world. You are administering a crude, brutal anesthetic. When someone in your group suffers a severe physical injury and the supply of modern painkillers has vanished, a heavy dose of vodka is often the only thing standing between them and lethal physiological shock. When the adrenaline finally crashes after a violent, terrifying confrontation and a survivor is hyperventilating in the corner, a chemical depressant forces their nervous system to physically reset. You stockpile the cheapest, highest-proof liquor because it requires a much smaller dose to achieve the necessary numbing effect. It forces a terrified, exhausted human being into deep, dreamless sleep, allowing their brain to briefly escape the unbearable, crushing weight of reality. Trade medium number 3 is absolute economic leverage. Look at the economic preparations of the average survivalist. They hoard precious metals. They bury heavy steel lockboxes full of silver eagles and gold fractions, assuming that shiny rocks will immediately reclaim their historical status as money. They believe a starving, desperate neighbor will eagerly trade a week's worth of canned food for a silver coin that has absolutely zero practical utility in a dead, burning world. They are preparing for a polite recession, not a total systemic wipeout. Gold only has value when society has the luxury of looking past tomorrow. In the savage, desperate heart of a true collapse, value is strictly measured by what a substance can physically do to keep you alive or numb your misery. You cannot drink a silver coin. You cannot sanitize a jagged wound with a gold bar. When starvation, disease, and violence are the immediate looming threats outside your door, luxury metals become heavy, useless burdens that only attract danger. Real wealth in the wasteland is purely functional and entirely ruthless. It is calories, it is ammunition, and it is vice. In any collapsed economy throughout human history, from war-torn blockades to hyperinflated failed states, the black market instantly and violently pivots to high-demand consumables. Cheap vodka is the perfect, universally recognized fiat currency of the apocalypse. It naturally comes divided into standard, easily tradable units like pints and handles. It does not need to be weighed, chemically assayed, or verified by a jeweler like gold dust. A factory-sealed bottle of clear alcohol is instantly recognized and universally desired by every single faction, scavenger, and desperate survivor you will ever encounter. You do not trade it for luxuries. You trade a single, cheap bottle of bottom-shelf vodka for an entire box of rifle ammunition from a man who is desperate to forget his reality for just one night. You trade a half-empty pint for critical tactical information, for temporary safe passage through a contested zone, or for a week's worth of scavenged antibiotics. You stockpile the nasty, unflavored stuff because the taste does not matter in the slightest. The chemical payload is all that matters. And the person who controls the chemical payload ultimately controls the local economy. Trade medium number 4 is off-grid chemical extraction. The misconception here is rooted in a highly romanticized view of wilderness survival. When modern preppers realize the pharmacies will eventually be picked clean, they pivot to fantasies of becoming frontier apothecaries. They stockpile massive libraries of botanical field guides and assume they will simply wander into the woods, forage for medicinal roots, and brew a nice healing tea over a campfire whenever someone gets sick. They assume that having the knowledge of what wild plants do is the exact same thing as having a reliable, year-round supply of actual medicine. But they fundamentally misunderstand the brutal mechanics of biochemistry and the changing of the seasons. Plants die in the winter. Roots freeze solid in the unforgiving earth. And even if you manage to brew a water-based remedy in the middle of a hot summer, it will turn rancid and grow lethal mold in a matter of days. The brutal reality of natural medicine is that it is entirely seasonal and highly unstable. If you cannot chemically lock the active compounds of the natural world into a permanent state, your botanical survival knowledge is entirely useless the moment the first frost hits. Nature does not dispense its cures on a convenient year-round schedule. You have a very narrow window of time to harvest what you need before the environment kills it. This is where cheap, bottom-shelf vodka transitions from a crude trade good into a highly advanced survival tool. Ethanol is a universal, aggressive solvent. It does not just kill bacteria on contact, it physically breaks down raw plant matter and strips out the active medicinal alkaloids, essential oils, and chemical compounds that human bodies desperately need to fight off illness. The tactical fix requires you to view your stockpile of cheap alcohol as a crude, post-collapse laboratory. You are not brewing temporary teas, you are manufacturing long-term medicinal tinctures. When you harvest willow bark for pain relief or echinacea for immune support during the short summer months, you do not dry it out and hope for the best. You crush it, pack it into a glass jar, and drown it in cheap vodka. The alcohol forcefully extracts the medicine from the dead plant tissue and suspends it in a sterile chemical vault. It prevents any mold, any rot, and any degradation. You store those jars in the dark, and 3 years later, in the dead of a freezing, starving winter, you will have liquid drops of concentrated medicine ready to dispense. You use the absolute cheapest vodka available, because the flavor and the impurities do not matter for chemical extraction. The ethanol does all the heavy lifting, turning a temporary summer harvest into a permanent, undeniable survival asset. This brings us to the ultimate, overarching reality of systemic collapse. When you look at the big picture of human survival, you must violently discard the shiny, tactical fantasies sold to you by modern marketing. We are conditioned to believe that survival is a matter of purchasing the right gear, of owning the most expensive rifle, or having the highest-grade titanium water filter. We build absolute fortresses of material wealth, assuming that the sheer monetary value of our preparations will somehow intimidate the apocalypse into leaving us alone. But the universe does not care about your credit limit. The grid does not care about how much you spend on your bunker. When the artificial structures of society burn away, the only things that retain actual value are the raw, ugly, fundamental tools that manipulate biology, psychology, and human desperation. Cheap vodka represents the dark, unglamorous truth of what it actually takes to stay alive when nobody is coming to save you. It is a harsh, burning liquid that forces a severe wound to remain clean. It is a heavy, chemical blanket that forces a shattered, traumatized mind to finally sleep. It is the raw solvent that locks fading natural medicine in a glass time capsule. And it is the ultimate, undeniable leverage you will hold over a world of people who are absolutely desperate for a way out of their reality. You do not stockpile it because it is pleasant or because it looks impressive on a basement shelf. You stockpile it because it is the brutal, highly effective currency of a broken world. In the end, the survivor who thrives is not the one holding a heavy bag of useless gold, but the one holding the crude chemical power to control infection, manipulate the mind, and dictate the terms of trade. Prepare for the reality of the wasteland, not the fantasy of the catalog. The ultimate currency is cheap, it is toxic, and it is waiting for the end of the world on the bottom shelf of your local grocery store.